Hey everyone, and welcome to What Did I Miss, where today I am counting down my top 10 favorite Deep Space Nine episodes of all time. If you are new to the channel, here we talk about all things Star Trek, as well as a lot of other cool sci-fi and comic book media. I love Star Trek, and the quality of stories and characters that Deep Space Nine produced week after week is a big reason why. I did put out a video on why Deep Space Nine is the best Star Trek, and there I did talk about 3 guilty pleasure episodes, and those were Move Along Home, Our Man Bashir, and Trials and Tribulations. So that's why I did not talk about them here, and those would probably round out a top 13 list for me. Honestly, the best argument I can make that Deep Space Nine is the best show in Star Trek is that even after discussing these episodes, there are still many that I left out that are better than 90% of anything you'll see on another show. Like the episodes in the Mirror Universe, the O'Brien Must Suffer line of episodes, in which poor Chief O'Brien has something horrible happen to him, the groovy hologram Vic Fontaine, Nog loses his leg, all the Trill stories, and then there's Kai Wynn. For a show known to be the dark side of the Star Trek universe, it produced more stories of heart, courage, love, strength, and camaraderie than any other show I can think of. Deep Space Nine was militaristic, it was raw, and it was the day-to-day interactions of interesting characters dropped into an impossible situation. Actors were given the freedom to develop their personalities of their characters, and reoccurring characters were given more screen time based on fan reaction. Even though it is said that the working conditions did not produce a lot of tender moments on set, the end product resonates as well or even more so than it did when it was released, and the fan base continues to grow. In fact, if you examine the tone of the 2 newest live-action incarnations of Star Trek, Discovery as well as Picard, you can argue that they are able to not be successful in a dark gray world due to the risks that were taken by the writers of Deep Space Nine. And in this video, I will go over each episode briefly and then give you why I think it is one of the best, but let me know in the comments what is your list. So here it is, my top 10 best Deep Space Nine episodes list of all time. Soldiers of the Empire. The premise of the episode deals with the Klingon General Martok trying to regain his former form after being a prisoner of war, which is a sign of great dishonor in their culture as Klingon warriors routinely commit suicide rather than be captured. He is given command of a vessel and due to his relationship with Worf, asks him to be his first officer. Worf and Jadzia Dax come along and they soon learn that the ship has not won a battle in some time and is filled with discontent. Martok also struggles with gaining the respect of the crew as they believe he has been weakened by captivity. Soon, after Martok decides against a chance at battle, the crew is on the verge of mutiny, but Worf steps up to challenge Martok for leadership of the ship. Martok ultimately wins the face-off and gains the respect of the crew, as well as proving to himself that he is capable of command again. In the end, the ship is able to defeat a jem'hadar vessel, which regains their honor, while Worf accepts a place in the House of Martok, formally joining Martok's family. The reason I love this episode is that it really gives us an intimate look at the Klingon culture. Even though Klingons are one of the Starfleet's oldest enemies, there is little revealed about them until the 90s, and even some aspects of their culture, and certainly their appearance, have been changed and retconned over the years. The episode accentuates this aura of mystery when the crew is talking at Quarks, and O'Brien mentions how he believes serving on a Klingon ship would be like serving with a band of bloodthirsty pirates, and Dax has to correct him given her own experience with a former host. Each Klingon on the ship has a distinct personality, which allows us to see that not all Klingons are outwardly brave, that they have doubts and fears, and they can actually make emotional connections with each other. This episode dispels many of the common tropes of what Klingons were shown to be up until that point, mostly as one-dimensional boorish characters without depth, with General Chang from Star Trek VI being a notable exception. At one point, Worf explains to Sisko how he and Martok were able to communicate subliminally while in battle, which is another example of the enormous depth of connection we learn that Klingons feel to their culture and race. My favorite scene is at the end of the episode where the entire bridge crew breaks into a song after Martok wins the crew over and orders them into battle. It gives me chills every time I see it. It makes me want to grab my batleth and shout Qapla'. The episode also solidifies Martok as a valiant Klingon general and brings Worf back into the fold in Klingon politics as a member of the House of Martok. Few episodes in Star Trek have been so important to the Klingon race as Soldiers of the Empire. The Magnificent Ferengi. Quark learns that his mother has been kidnapped by the Dominion and that he has been tasked to arrange her release. Having a deep appreciation and sense of pride for his race, he decides to construct a squad of Ferengi to rescue his mother. One by one, Quark is able to find 5 other Ferengi to help build a team, and he begins to train them to be brave comrades. After it becomes obvious to everyone involved that the team will not be able to liberate their subject using force, Quark devises a plan more in line with their abilities of the team. He arranges a prisoner exchange with the Dominion using a Vorta captured in the episode Rocks and Shoals after negotiating a deal with Sisko and Kira. They meet the Dominion on the replica Deep Space Nine space station Empok Nor, but before they are able to make the exchange, the Vorta prisoner dies in an unforeseen accident, and the team must again think of a way to complete the rescue. Nog, being a capable engineer and avid fan of the movie Weekend at Bernie's, is able to make the Vorta appear to be alive long enough for the team to make the exchange, subdue the jem'hadar on the station, and capture the Vorta negotiator. Originally planned to be the main villains of Star Trek The Next Generation, the Ferengi's first few appearances were not received well. After being poorly reviewed, they are relegated to purely comic relief characters for the rest of the series. The writers of Deep Space Nine were not only brave enough to revive them, but added a Ferengi as a main character in Quark, as well as added his extended family of Rom and Nog to the reoccurring cast. Over the years, these characters did a lot to flesh out a new image for the Ferengi, and that culture is showcased in this episode. Early on in the episode, Quark is annoyed that his bravery in business is not seen as significant as the bravery of Starfleet personnel on the station, which sets the tone. In his mind, he's the bravest man on the station, but since, as Odo points out, they are not on Ferenginar, the station just sees him as a cheat. Throughout the episode, we get to learn about Ferengi culture, including a 300-type story of a battle in which 10 Ferengi stood against 273 attackers. There are also plenty of laughs and homages throughout the episode, including a scene right out of the Magnificent Seven, as well as my aforementioned reference to a Great Weekend at Bernie's-like scene with a reanimated hostage. We also get 2 great Vortas in the episode, with one of them being played by none other than Iggy Pop. But where this episode really shines is that it redefines how we look at things like bravery and courage. What one culture sees as courage, another man may seem as deceitful, and there are many times throughout the series that Quark and Sisko discuss both of their cultures' respective histories and how Quark feels that humans are much more barbaric than Ferengi ever were. This episode proves that Ferengi are much more than comic relief and are in fact a valuable piece of Star Trek lore. Past tense. After reviewing 2 episodes that were filled with lighthearted action, you know that eventually we would come across a dark episode, and Past Tense definitely qualifies as one of the darker installments of Star Trek history. This is also the first example on this list of serialized storytelling through multiple episodes, which became a staple of DS9, even though the producers were warned that it would alienate fans. This 2-part episode has Sisko, Bashir, and Dax traveling back in time due to a transporter accident and throws them into a tumultuous event in Earth's future history known as the Bell Riots. Landing in San Francisco in 2024, Dax is separated from the group and found by a wealthy businessman, but Sisko and Bashir are left on their own and quickly rounded up by local police. After being processed into a sanctuary district, which is basically just a demilitarized zone, Sisko realizes what time period they're in, and that in days an event known as the Bell Riots will occur where they are. Even though they try to stay out of the events of history, they are inadvertently involved in the death of Gabriel Bell, whom the riots were named after. Sisko takes on the persona of Bell and tries to keep the peace as internal and external forces threaten to tear the city apart. Meanwhile, Dax realizes that Sisko and Bashir must be in the sanctuary district and works to not only help them stay safe, but uses her newfound relationship with a telecommunications magnet to bring light on the situation there. Even still, future takes place as it is meant to, and the military attacks the sanctuary district, killing many innocent inhabitants. Although tragic, it is made clear that without these events occurring, the future would not have evolved to what it had become. Eventually, O'Brien and Kira are able to find the group and transport them back to safety. Star Trek has always been a pioneer when it comes to giving a platform to stories that expose social injustice, and this episode is a fantastic example of the creative risk that the show allowed its writers on a weekly basis. Using the Attica prison riot of 1971 as inspiration, this episode speaks volumes about the many issues we still face as a society. With protests and rioting about social injustice being a daily occurrence in 2020, it's not hard to imagine the world that this episode exists in. In fact, while this episode was in production back in 1994, the Los Angeles City Council was trying to pass an ordinance that would create sanctuaries for the homeless population there, much to the horror of the crew. It is also not a coincidence that Dax finds herself in different circumstances than Sisko and Bashir do, and the episode is able to show this commentary without it being heavy-handed. The writers also expose the role that media has in a crisis, another very topical issue today, and shows that Deep Space Nine is just as relevant as it ever was. Not to mention, there are 2 great bad guys to hate in the episode, in Frank Military as BC and Dick Miller as Vin, plus a cameo by Tranya spokesman Clint Howard, and you have a fantastic episode that will make you think about the future, the past, and the present in ways science fiction is meant to do. The Jem'hadar. What starts off as a planned father and son camping trip quickly goes haywire in an episode that will help shape the direction of the series thereafter. Commander Sisko, in an attempt to get his low-tech son interested in science, plans a short getaway for them in the Gamma Quadrant. Jake decides to invite Nog along to help them with his schoolwork, which provides Quark an opportunity to tag along in an attempt to gain favor with Sisko. While Quark continually attempts to impress Benjamin, it is Nog who actually starts to get on his good side as Sisko recognizes Nog's desire to learn the ways of the Federation, which is ironically what he'd been looking for in his son. But this quickly comes to a halt when they realize they are being hunted by an unseen force. Benjamin and Quark are captured and put into an electronic cell, while Jake and Nog are able to get to the runabout and escape. While in captivity, they meet a Vorta that describes their captors as the Jem'hadar, and this would be the first full mentions of the Vorta or Jem'hadar in the series, while the Dominion had been mentioned in passing on various occasions. After the crew at DS9 is able to find Jake and Nog, the Federation mounts a task force to rescue the group. As the task force arrives in the Gamma Quadrant, Quark is able to free the Vorta from a collar that was suppressing her, which she then uses to disable the force field confining them. After they are able to subdue subdue the 2 jem'hadar guards, they are transported safely off the planet. As the task force attempts to leave the Gamma Quadrant, the jem'hadar send a shocking kamikaze attack and destroy a Galaxy-class starship. Once back on the station, Quark reveals to Sisko that upon examining the collar that was worn by the Vorta, he discovered that it had no use except for that of a complicated locking mechanism. Before the crew is able to detain the Vorta, she is able to transport off the station, showing that the Dominion are a more powerful force than the Federation are accustomed to fighting. The Dominion War is probably what Deep Space Nine is most famous for, and there is no doubt that the seeds of war are planted in this episode. In fact, the original title of the episode was Dominion, and at one point the crew of the Enterprise was called on to help stop the invasion force. Not only is this the first appearance of the Dominion, but it established them as a terrifying invasion force that could have destroyed the Enterprise as easily as they destroyed the ship in the episode, which is why a Galaxy-class starship was chosen by the writer. Besides this awesome act of violence, the jem'hadar show their dominance by transporting on and off the station at will and admitting to destroying Bajoran colonies in the Gamma Quadrant. There are also subtle setups to future plot threads, like the Jem'Hadar's desire to meet Klingons in battle, as well as the need for the Federation to develop new technology to fight this threat, which will lead to the commission of the Defiant at Deep Space Nine. But besides the main plot, the B plot line of this episode is also really strong, as it deals with the relationship of the human father and son and their Ferengi traveling companions. One of the most important recurring themes of the series is the bond between Benjamin and Jake, and some of the building blocks are laid out in this episode. Ben Sisko is certainly not happy that Jake is getting advice from his friend Nog, who happens to be Ferengi, which is a race that Sisko does not seem to respect. This leads to a great scene with Quark and Sisko, whereas Quark calls out Earth's history as barbaric and that Sisko has no right to judge him by the perceived failures of his race unless he accepts Quark to treat him in kind. Throughout the series, Quark is fighting for the respect of Ferengi at DS9, as well as in Star Trek fandom, and this episode establishes his deep devotion to his race, which I mentioned earlier. Even Odo seems to care more about Quark than we were initially led to believe, as he volunteers to help look for him when he is captured. There is no doubting that the Jem'Hadar is one of the pivotal chapters of Deep Space Nine, and that it establishes the incoming threat of the Dominion. The Wire. One of the most fascinating and recurring characters to appear on any version of Star Trek is the plain and simple Cardassian tailor on Deep Space Nine, Elam Garak. What makes Garak so compelling are his motives, because even into the last season, we never really know exactly whose side Garak is on. At times, he is shown to be a brave soldier of Cardassia, and at other times, he seems to be an unscrupulous spy that you never want to turn your back on. The episode The Wire gives us the deepest look into Garak's past, but as you would expect with Garak, even the lies are true. The episode starts off with Bashir and Garak having lunch, which we learn has become a frequent occurrence for a year, even though Bashir admits to Dax that he does not see Garak as a friend. In past episodes, it also seemed that Garak was just amused by Bashir and took pleasure in confusing him with half-truths and riddles about his past. While in line to have lunch, Garak becomes uncharacteristically agitated and storms off appearing to have a headache. Later on that day, Bashir overhears Garak speaking with Quark covertly, and when he questions Quark about it, Quark is less than helpful. Hours later, Bashir is called back to Quark as Garak is now drunk on Kanar and causing a scene, which is also unordinary for the usually subdued tailor. As Bashir tries to escort Garak from the establishment, he collapses into a seizure and is transported to the infirmary. Bashir finds a device in Garak's brain that he believes was put there by the Obsidian Order, the covert section of Cardassia's military whom we are introduced to in this episode, and are Garak's supposed former employers. They learn that the device was put there to administer endorphins during interrogations so he would not feel pain. But Garak, being absolutely miserable in exile, has left the device on for 2 years, which has caused a neurological imbalance similar to a drug addiction. Together, they decide to remove the device and allow Garak to suffer through withdrawal to rid himself of the need for it. During his mission to help Garak, Bashir travels to Cardassia and finds Garak's former mentor, Inabran Tain. Tain agrees to provide the needed information to design a cure, but if only to prolong Garak's suffering in exile, since it turns out that he's the one that sent him there. We also get a few stories about why Garak was exiled and even who he really is, which confound Bashir but also intrigue him. In the end, he's able to cure Garak, and this episode marks the beginning of a deep, complicated friendship, while also establishing Garak as one of the most compelling characters ever to appear on Star Trek. There have been many bromances in the history of Star Trek, but the one that makes so much sense because it makes no sense at all is Dr. Julian Bashir and Elam Garak. Star Trek has a habit of putting odd couples together, and these two could not have been more different from one another when they first meet. When we are introduced to Dr. Bashir in the pilot, he is a brash, immature, idealistic romantic who believes he can save the universe with his medicine. On the other hand, Garak is, well, who is Garak? If you put all the crumbs together, he was a high-ranking spy in the Obsidian Order until he was exiled shortly before the end of the Cardassian occupation of Bajor. In this episode, we start to peel back the layers on both characters and in turn get fantastic performances from both actors, especially the performance of Andrew Robinson as Garak. The script originally had Major Kira suffering from a drug addiction, but the writers felt this would weaken the character, and I can't imagine this episode being as successful with anyone other than Garak. There are many stories we get throughout the years about him, but they all seem to be coded in such a way that if you put together every third word, you get the actual truth. So while Bashir appears to be an open book, Garak is more of an encrypted message. Together, each influences the other throughout the series, and eventually, Bashir loses his optimistic smile, but Garak Garak earns his back. This is also the first episode that mentions the Obsidian Order as well as an Abrantane, who like Garak was set to be a one-time guest star, but because of fan popularity the character was brought back multiple times in some of DS9's most essential episodes. The Way of the Warrior. The episode begins in high gear with the crew completing a battle drill to heighten their preparedness for the possibility of a changeling infiltrator. Shortly after, they find themselves surrounded by a Klingon fleet commanded by General Martok, which would be this very important character's first appearance. There's immediate tension as Klingons swarm the station and start to cause havoc, which includes attacking Garak in his shop. Soon after, a ship commanded by Cassidy Yates is accosted by a Klingon patrol, and the Defiant is required to intervene to ensure their safety. Sisko understands that he needs help handling the Klingons, so he calls on Lieutenant Commander Worf from the USS Enterprise for help. Worf begins to mingle with the crew, and after a spirited holosuite fight with Dax, he calls on an old family friend to help. From the conversation, he learns that the Klingon Empire believes the Cardassian government has been overthrown by changelings and intends to invade their homeworld. Knowing that if they warn Cardassia about the invasion, they'd essentially be informing an enemy about an ally, Sisko uses Garak to get the information to Cardassia. But even with the warning, they are not able to stop the invasion force, and Cardassia falls to the Klingon Empire. In a rare event, Sisko and Dukat work together to save members of the Cardassian government, and in doing so, Sisko risks the crew of the Defiant in a rescue attempt. They are able to succeed but bring a good portion of the Klingon fleet back with them to Deep Space Nine. The Klingons attack and are able to board the station and engage the crew in hand-to-hand combat, the likes of which were rarely seen on Star Trek up until that point. Eventually, the crew is able to regain control and repel the invaders with the promise that this is the first battle of many. This episode also marks a change of career for Worf as he switches to the command division as well as back to the red uniform. This episode marks a large amount of changes for not only the series, but the characters as well. With Voyager entering its second season, the writers of Deep Space Nine wanted to make sure they could keep the audience watching two Star Trek shows that did not involve the USS Enterprise, so it's no coincidence that a cast member from The Next Generation was added. Bashir and Dax also both were promoted in between seasons to full lieutenant and lieutenant commander, and Avery Brooks changed his look by finally being able to shave his head and wear a goatee. But the biggest change to the Star Trek landscape was the return of the Klingons as the bad guys, after Gowron, the Klingon Chancellor, tears up the treaty they had with the Federation, discharges Worf's family from the Empire, and attacks Deep Space Nine. Eventually, we learn the attack was in fact planned by the Dominion, and that Martok is a changeling. Another big moment in the episode is a scene in which Garak and Dukat stand side by side in battle, which Garak later mentions as a time when he could have killed Dukat and saved the station a lot of trouble. With all the callbacks and foreshadowing, there's so much connective tissue interwoven into this two-part thriller that it may be one of the most important episodes in all of Star Trek. In the Pale Moonlight. Sometimes it is easy for science fiction to gloss over the casualties of war. Many times, space battles involve large ships that explode and kill hundreds of nameless faces so that the audience can concentrate on the action and follow just a few main characters. But In the Pale Moonlight shows that the cost of war can turn anyone against their own convictions, especially in the cold reaches of space. The episode begins with Benjamin Sisko speaking directly to us in the form of recording a log about the events that had transpired. He explains that Starfleet morale was at its lowest point, and the weekly casualty reports he posts along with the current status of the war is taking a toll on him. He decides that the only way to turn the tide of the war is to get the Romulans to break their current non-aggression treaty with the Dominion and enter the war. Given the reluctant nature of the Romulans, Sisko knows that this will be no easy task and first tries to create a diplomatic solution with Dax's help. After realizing that this type of normal diplomacy will not work, the Dominion invades the planet Beta Z, which is a big strategic loss for the Federation. Sisko devises a plan with Garak to fabricate evidence that the Dominion are planning on invading the Romulan homeworld, conceding that since he is well-intentioned, the ends justify the means. Even though Garak warns him about dancing with the devil, Sisko threatens multiple people, bribes Quark, and abuses his command with Bashir to ensure his plan succeeds. At first, it seems that it was all for nothing as the Romulan Center is able to see through the fabrication in dramatic fashion, but it turns out that Garak had a different plan all along and plants a bomb in the Senator's shuttle, knowing that the death of a high-ranking official will bring the Romulans into the war. The Romulans enter the war and almost immediately helps the Federation allies' chances against the Dominion, but at the cost of Sisko's self-respect. In the end, it seems that while this deeply affects Sisko, he's able to live with his actions. Deep Space Nine was really able to go places that other Trek shows were not in regard to its ability to tell the gray area stories. The tales where there are no good guys, and this episode gives us a look at the difficult decisions commanders make in wartime. In fact, the Gulf of Tonkin incident along with the Watergate scandal were referenced as inspirations for the storyline. In the episode, the Federation is happy to allow the plan to proceed and in fact is complicit in the events, even convincing the Klingon Empire to release a prisoner into Sisko's custody that is later killed. Throughout the monologue, Sisko's appearance becomes more and more disheveled, which acts as a metaphor as he sheds the Federation values that he was trained to follow. There are plenty of times where we have seen Kirk ignore orders to go off on a mission to save the galaxy, but this is the first time we get to watch a vaulted officer reduced to a desperate racketeer over the course of a few days. At one point, Sisko admits that Starfleet even gave the plan their blessing, which should make him feel better, but doesn't. He knows what he is doing is wrong, but it will not stop him even after the Senator is killed. Once again, Garak acts as a catalyst for the most shocking events of the story, even though, as he so pointedly points out, that is why Sisko came to him for help in the first place. This episode is another fantastic character piece for Avery Brooks to shine in, and by the end of it, you definitely have a different impression of his character going forward. He has a way of being sympathetic but strong all at once, so that you feel compelled to stay on his side while he commits these uncharacteristic acts. All in all, this episode makes you think about the cost of war and how the road to hell is often paved with the best intentions. In Purgatory Shadow and By Inferno's Light. Together, In Purgatory Shadow and By Inferno's Light are another two-part story that would help define the mythology of Deep Space Nine. The episode starts with Odo adjusting to life as a changeling again after he was turned into a human being by the female changeling for a number of months. After receiving a message coded in Cardassian cipher, Odo reaches out to Garak, who translates the message as an out-of-date survey report. In reality, the message is an SOS from Garak's mentor in Aubryn Tane, who is believed to have been killed in a battle against the Dominion in a prior episode. Garak tries to steal a runabout, but Dr. Bashir is waiting for him, and after hearing his plan, escorts him to the ops. Sisko decides to allow Garak to investigate the source of the transmission, but only if he takes Worf along. After some great banter between the two, Garak and Worf are captured by the Dominion, but not before they stumble upon an invasion fleet hiding close to the wormhole. Worf attempts to send a message to Deep Space Nine before they are captured, but the station is not able to retrieve it. Upon arriving at the Dominion POW camp, they are shocked to find not only Tane, but the real versions of General Martok and Dr. Bashir. Dr. Bashir explains that he had been taken 4 months prior, while Martok had endured at the camp for over 2 years, having to fight jem'hadar soldiers in a sort of prison fight club. Garak is reunited with Tane, who at first chides him for getting himself captured, but before his death seems to acknowledge that Garak is his illegitimate son. Back at Deep Space Nine, the crew devises a plan to close the wormhole, but it is sabotaged by the fake Bashir, and the Dominion fleet is allowed to enter Federation space without issue. In another shocking twist, instead of destroying the station, the Dominion fleet heads towards Cardassia with Dukat in tow, signifying his return as a villain to the series, as well as the Cardassian government joining the Dominion. Back at the POW camp, Worf has taken Martok's place as champion, is now fighting 5 to 7 battles a day against jem'hadar soldiers, while Garak works to get a signal to the runabout, which would transport them away. Dukat contacts Sisko and boasts about his accomplishment of turning the war in Cardassia's favor, while threatening to take the station back by force if the Federation does not surrender it. Not long after Cardassia joining the Dominion, the Klingons have begun to take heavy losses, and Chancellor Gowron returns to Deep Space Nine and decides to re-sign the Khitomer Accords, which was the long-standing treaty with the Federation that he recently abolished. As the Klingon fleet lays in wait for the impending battle, a Romulan squadron arrives as well, believing a Dominion attack is impending. Sisko sends 2 runabouts on the Defiant out to help defend the station, not knowing that the fake Dr. Bashir has commandeered one of the runabouts. As they stand waiting for the Dominion, Garak is able to contact the runabout just as the group are about to be executed, and they contact the station letting them know that the Bashir they have is an imposter. They ascertain that he is trying to destroy the nearby sun, which would destroy Bajor, Deep Space Nine, as well as the entire fleet, and are able to stop him just before he arrives at his target. The entire task force stands down as they realize the depth of the ruse, and Sisko is able to tell Dukat that Armageddon will have to wait for another day. This episode for me is all about the characters finding out who they really are, and no, I don't mean from a blood screen. From the beginning of the story where Odo is regretful that he's no longer a solid, to the last line where Sisko and Dukat try to intimidate each other, this story deals with each character overcoming their own doubts. Just look at the plan the Dominion came up with. They were able to almost win the war by placing one changeling on the station and threatening an attack that never came. It is just another example that in this war, and on Deep Space Nine, nothing is ever exactly what it seems. But Worf and Garak really get to do the best work in the show, as together they save the day as a very unlikely pair. Worf has some great scenes as a Klingon version of Maximus, tearing through jem'hadar no matter how bloody or battered he is. Later on, he concedes that he was ready to die, but Martok was able to give him his Klingon warrior's heart so that he could overcome and fight on. The bond between Worf and Martok is cemented in this story, and is one that would lead to Worf regaining his name in the Empire. Andrew Robinson has another outstanding performance, which in this case hit very close to home, as both the actor and the character suffer from claustrophobia. His scenes in a tight wall space are very engaging and make you feel like you are there in the wall with him. The scenes he shares with Tane also show a side of Garak we had not seen before, yet it may have been the most honest version of Garak we get in any episode. Garak and Worf also earn a mutual respect for each other, which would seem like an impossibly odd pairing. This episode is one of the best of Deep Space Nine because it pushes my favorite characters into new depths while telling a compelling story of espionage mixed with bravery. Far Beyond the Stars. As I mentioned earlier, Star Trek has always been eager to give a platform for stories of social injustice. The most powerful example in the entire franchise is the Deep Space Nine episode Far Beyond the Stars, which not only starred but also was directed by Avery Brooks. In it, the Prophets throw Benjamin Sisko into a vision that takes him to 1950s America and transforms him into a struggling science fiction writer. All the main actors in the series play characters in the vision, each appearing without their usual makeup and taking on the persona of a player within the vision quest. Benjamin Sisko becomes Benny Russell, who is inspired by a drawn picture to write a story about a brown-skinned captain of a space station. He does this knowing that there will be issues with the publication due to the rampant and unabashed racism of the era. Benny continuously has to overcome the ignorance and racism of the time as he is intimidated by the police and rejected by his boss, while also being told by his best friend and girlfriend that he should give up on trying to be a writer. After he agrees to amend his story to make it all a dream, which they believe will create less controversy, his best friend is shot in the street and he himself is beaten badly by the same police who bothered him the night before. After recuperating at home, Benny returns to work only to find that the magazine he works for will not be producing an issue that month due to his story being a part of it. What happens next is a gut-wrenching monologue about the deferment of dreams and the insidious nature of racism that rivals any given in the history of cinema. In the end, Benjamin Sisko remains, but upon further reflection on his experience, he is left with the question of is he the dreamer or the dream? If you go looking for other top 10 lists of Deep Space Nine or even all Star Trek episodes, you will undoubtedly see this episode somewhere on that list. But this is another example of an episode that only Deep Space Nine could pull off due to the way the tone of the show skewed from that of the original, as well as the cast of actors attached. There are many scenes in the episode that feature only brown-skinned people, which is something that was rare at the time that anyone watching now may take for granted. Not to mention Avery Brooks, who very proudly has a master's degree in acting as well as directing and is taught at the collegiate level, is the only man who could have not only shaped the vision of the episode from the director's chair, but also gave a performance that you can see he leaves a part of himself in. At the end of the famous monologue where Benny Russell claims his legitimacy as a human being, Avery Brooks collapses on the floor after breaking down from the stress of the situation. In the documentary What We Leave Behind, Nana Visitor admits that the look of worry on her face as she catches him from hitting the floor is genuine, as Avery Brooks could not pull himself out of character for some time, even after the camera stopped. The world that is created by the set and costume design is very engaging and real, which is another hallmark of the production quality of this franchise. While this does not top my list of best episodes, I'll admit that as a father, this is the one episode that I hope my kids eventually watch and learn from. Above all else, the best art is the kind that causes you to have a reaction and think about things that you may not always think about, and this episode should definitely do that as it endures as a masterpiece of acting and storytelling. Favor the Bold and Sacrifice of the Angels. If Deep Space Nine had gotten a movie, these 2 episodes in Season 6 would have been it. The basis of the story is that the Federation is retaking Deep Space Nine based on a plan designed by Captain Sisko. It has been months since the Defiant and most of the crew have abandoned the station after an assault by the Dominion, and after many retreats, morale is very low. In that time, the female changeling has tried to coerce Odo into rejoining their people and leaving his old life behind. This, she explains, is more important to her and the Dominion than winning the entire war. The only thing preventing the Dominion from winning the war is a minefield that was erected near the wormhole just as the crew abandoned the station. Damar, Ducat's right-hand man, has a plan to destroy the minefield, and this pressures the Federation to act quickly before the only thing preventing a full-on invasion from the Gamma Quadrant is destroyed. Martok takes Worf to convince Chancellor Gowron to send a fleet of ships into battle with them, as he rightly states that since Gowron doesn't trust Worf, having an enemy and friend tell him the same thing should convince him. Kira and a resistance cell on the station are also on a clock, as Rom is scheduled to be executed for his involvement with them. Damar is very suspicious of Kira, as well as Ziyal, who is Ducat's daughter, and whom he believes are both members of this group. Ducat is in his full glory, as he expects that victory is at hand, and all the respect that he so intensely craves will finally be bestowed on him. After Odo is told by the female changeling that Kira will also be killed due to her part in the Resistance, Odo decides to help the Resistance and free the group from custody. What happens next is one of the largest battles in Star Trek history, as over 2,000 ships meet head-on for the fate of the Quadrant. When things look dark for the good guys, the Klingons join the battle like the Riders of Rohan and are able to break the line, which allows the Defiant a path to Deep Space Nine. On Deep Space Nine, the Resistance is able to break Rom and the others out of jail with some help from Odo and attempt to stop Damar from destroying the mines. They are 1 second too late, as Ducat gives the order to destroy the minefield and it is removed permanently. Knowing that there is a fleet waiting to travel to the Alpha Quadrant through the wormhole, Sisko sends the Defiant in to meet them but is whisked away by the Prophets. They argue that he is too important to end his life at this time and agree to help him and Bajor in exchange for a price that is not known to the audience or the captain at this time. In a flash, the Dominion's fleet is removed from the wormhole, never to be seen again, and the Defiant returns to of Deep Space Nine. Dukat cannot fathom how he is lost when victory was so certain, and he collapses mentally as the Dominion is forced to abandon Deep Space Nine with the combined Federation and Klingon fleet incoming. During the ruckus, Ziyal admits to her father that she was part of the Resistance and is partially responsible for his defeat, which Dukat forgives her for right before she is killed by Damar. This completely destroys Dukat as he has left a whimpering, broken version of himself and concedes defeat to Captain Sisko by handing him his prized baseball, which Sisko left on his desk before he left as a sign that he would be back. I honestly believe that you can make an argument for any of these episodes as the greatest in the history of Deep Space Nine. But why I think this storyline is the best is because this is DS9 at its highest, most developed point. All of the actors own their performances, from background characters like Ram and Nog to the weekly stars of the show. One of Deep Space Nine, and you could say Star Trek's most beloved reoccurring faces, is Jeffrey Combs, and his performance as Weyoun in this episode is very nuanced and establishes some interesting characteristics of the Vorta that had not been previously known. His character is the ultimate politician, an amiable husk, completely bereft of common sense, but malleable and useful to those in power. Next to the Andorian badass General Shran from Enterprise, this is my favorite Jeffrey Combs. Mark Alamo also gives an amazing performance, and I don't believe he gets enough credit for being the villain that he is. If Weyoun is the consummate politician, Dukat is the consummate fascist dictator that wants his people to love him above all else, but hates them all along the way. This obsession includes his relationships with Major Kira and his daughter, both of whom he desperately tries to win over with varied levels of success. Ziyal's death cracks the mask of purity that was keeping him together, and for the rest of the show, his character descends into a pit of true evil villainy. The events of this storyline also set up Benjamin Sisko's final exit from Deep Space Nine, which unfortunately leads him down the path of the tragic hero. There are also some good reunions, like Martok and Sisko finally getting to that barrel of blood wine, and Dax and Worf, who can now get married a few episodes later. It also allows Odo to choose Kira over his own people, which was a big step for his character and their relationship as well as his relationship with his people. And in the middle of all this good storytelling is the largest space battle ever on screen in Star Trek. I love the scene with O'Brien reciting a poem before the battle, because scenes like this really make you feel like the space battles can be just as real as the greatest land or sea battles from our history. The ending is also very clever. First, we are meant to think that the crew is going to save the minefield just in time, but then they don't. Then we get a great Jon Snow-esque scene with Sisko taking the Defiant up against the whole armada, and the Prophet save them from certain defeat. Now, you could say this is a cop-out, but because of this sacrifice of the angels that did save the Federation, Sisko won't be able to live a happy life after this on Bajor. It's interesting how both titles work into the storylines. First episode title is reference to an ancient Klingon proverb that fortune favors the bold, and the Klingons are the ones that ended up being the reason the Federation won the battle. This is just one of those magic moments when an epic storyline is brought to life by a talented, well-developed cast that deliver a monumental performance. It stands as a testament to why the best stories of Star Trek were told on Deep Space Nine. Well, that is my list, but let me know in the comments. What did I miss? Were there episodes that I did not have, or did I get some in the wrong order? Let me know your top 10 in the comments below. If you would like to support the channel, hit that like button on the video, and subscribe and hit the bell for the latest Star Trek videos I release. And I will see you next time on What Did I Miss?